So welcome to tonight's discussion on BIPOC and mental health. Once again, I am Sky Lea Ross, Psy.D candidate, marriage and family therapist, and trauma therapist. So what does BIPOC mean? If you're new to this term or it's something that's just not familiar to you, essentially it's just Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Why do we use it? So we're trying to move away from terms such as minorities when referring to marginalized ethnic groups, because that just sounds really reductive. You know, when we say minorities, it focuses on quantity rather than quality. We're not really looking at their personhood or their lives as a whole. It's also inaccurate because these populations are steadily growing within the US every single year. There's projections that within the next 30 years, it will be predominantly BIPOC. So obviously it's not even really accurate statement to make. And globally, BIPOC are the majority of the world. So it's interesting that that is the term that we've been using for such a long time. But yeah, we're just trying to move away from it. And by saying BIPOC, it refrains from having any type of stigmatizing connotation. When you call groups minorities, it kind of sounds like we're saying they're inferior or subordinate or second-class citizens. And that's exactly the opposite of what we're trying to do, if anything. So there's just better terminology, and that's what is being embraced now. You know, we might make mistakes, and that's totally fine. You can say minorities. It's not necessarily politically incorrect, but a lot of organizations, research, literature, major not nonprofits, but major entities that create research and write literature and write history, we're trying to start incorporating the use of BIPOC more often. So it's not necessarily incorrect by any means to say minorities. It's just more stigmatizing. It's just kind of a more negative way of referring to the population. So it's just a better way of putting it. It also places the most marginalized Black and Indigenous peoples at the forefront of the discussion because they have been the most substantially disenfranchised, underrepresented, and underserved. They're often omitted from conversations. A lot of their history is erased from textbooks, literally. So it puts them at the forefront of all of these discussions. And this is really just about using person-centered and person-first language. So when referring to a particular person, just use that person's identity. You know, try not to assume if you don't know for sure, but if you're able to ask, go ahead and do so. But if you see a Black person, you can say, oh, that's a Black man. Oh, there was a Black man walking over there, you know, or, oh, there was an Asian lady down the street, or I was speaking to a Native American woman, you know, just simply put. When referring to a group or a particular race of a particular race, use their ethnicity or racial identity. So a group of Black men, a group of Black individuals, a group of Asian women. And referring to a diverse group, it's fine to just say a racially diverse group or a group of people of color or a group of BIPOC. You know, you can say that. Again, this is not about being perfect, and this is not about being extremely politically correct. And it's also not about power and control. I remember one time I was on Facebook and I was talking to someone and they had used a term, I think, like transgendered. And I explained to them, we don't say transgendered, we say a transgender person. Transgender is an adjective, it's not a noun. And they got really upset with me. And they were saying, oh, you millennials, you're just trying to control everything we say. Y'all just want power over how we speak. It's not about control. It's really just about empathy. It's about compassion. You know, we're talking about marginalized peoples here. And we want to give that as much respect and courtesy and compassion as possible. So this is just about using language that is more accepting, that is more embracing, and less derogatory and less stigmatized. That's all this is about. So why a colorblind approach is problematic? Sometimes you hear people say things like, I don't see color, I just see people. And they think that this eliminates racism. They think that this is loving and compassionate, but in reality, it's problematic. It's misguided because if you don't see color, you're not seeing the beauty, the complexity, the uniqueness that BIPOC community has to offer, but you're also turning a blind eye to the disparities, the systemic oppression, the racial injustices that they face. I happen to be a fan of the drama series This Is Us. It is such an amazing show. It touches on amazing topics. And there was an episode where Jack Pearson, who's pictured here with his son Randall, he's having a conversation with his adopted son about race. And if you're not familiar with the show, basically This Is Us follows Jack Pearson and Rebecca Pearson, and they have a blended family where they have triplets, and one of them, Randall, happens to be Black. Whereas his siblings, Kate and Kevin, happen to be white. And so he grows up with them. And there's a specific episode where they happen to be talking about this topic. And Jack tells his son, I don't see color, I see my son. And Randall claps back with, then you don't see me, Dad. And that's really what it is. I think that's the gist of it, is that if you're saying you don't see color, then you're not seeing our humanity, really. You're not seeing everything we have to offer, but also everything that we go through and how society does see color. Even if you are not seeing color, society sure does and treats us accordingly. So again, just something to remember. I hear this all the time, and I think it's with the best of intentions, but there's a statement saying something like the best of intentions lead to hell. So just be careful, be mindful about this statement. It's really not the most beneficial. It's really not the most appropriate. So let's get right into it. BIPOC and mental health. So this graph is the most recent numbers I could find. So some of the slides have infographics that are not completely up to date. So these are the most recent numbers. But as you can see, you would assume that BIPOC would have higher amounts of mental illness, but actually many of them have lower rates than their white and Caucasian counterparts. So mixed race is always notably the highest. And this is not just true for mental illness. This is also true for other health conditions, as well as intimate partner violence and other types of trauma. And that's an interesting discussion that I'll get a little bit into later. Native American, Indigenous peoples definitely have a very high amount of mental health conditions. Black African American are right below whites with 17%, Latinx Hispanic community at 15%, and the Asian American Pacific Islander community is about at 13%. And like I said, these are the most recent or up-to-date statistics that I could find. And according to the APA and the CDC, rates of mental illness are comparable across ethnic groups. As you can see, many have numbers very similar to whites and Caucasians or even lower. However, when it comes to BIPOC, the persistence of symptoms or the level of disability caused by mental illness are often much greater, and that is because of many different factors. So let's start with the Black and African American community and mental health. So again, the numbers on these infographics are just a little outdated. I believe that the number that we just saw was actually a little bit higher than that. I think it was about 17%. Excuse me, I think it was, let me go back real quick. Yes, it's at 17%. I was right. Should have stuck with my guns there. But yeah, so that's about 7 million people, give or take, might be a little bit more now. So that's more people than the populations of Chicago, Houston, and Philadelphia combined. So that is a lot of people. So only 1/3 of Black individuals who need mental health care receive it. Approximately 25% of Black individuals are not covered by health insurance, in contrast with only 7% of non-Hispanic whites. Black individuals make up only 12.6% of the US population, according to the most recent census data. However, they are nearly 40% of the incarcerated population. Rates of depression and anxiety are often much more persistent for Black individuals, often due to racial trauma or other systemic inequities, such as poverty or lack of culturally competent care, etc. 27% of Black individuals live below the poverty line, and 30% of Black households are headed by single women, in contrast to only 9% of white households. And this is an interesting subject itself, because Black women are often predisposed to the stereotype, oh, strong Black woman, oh, Black women are so independent, yeah. That's actually more detrimental than it is beneficial. Sure, you're calling us strong and you're saying we can take on so much and we're so resilient, but that often leaves us doing everything for ourselves, being hyper independent, to the point of we're burned out because we're taking care of everyone else. And at the end of the day, we may not have the energy or time to even take care of ourselves properly. So as you can imagine, that's only going to exacerbate any mental health challenges. And just this quote here, socioeconomic status in turn is linked to mental health. People who are impoverished, homeless, incarcerated, or have substance use problems are at higher risk for poor mental health. Again, that should be pretty common sense. That should be straightforward. But that's just why I'm noting here the statistics about the poverty, about the lack of health insurance, and how many people are actually receiving treatment. Black individuals are more likely to be misdiagnosed with schizophrenia than mood disorders, despite showing the same symptoms as their white counterparts. And this is a problem. This has been going on for quite a few years. For some reason, there's this mislabel, there's this misnomer that Black individuals are more likely to be schizophrenic, when that's actually not the case. For some reason, well, I shouldn't say some reason, because of inherent racism and discrimination, a lot of times providers they apply the schizophrenia diagnosis to Black individuals, even though their symptoms are more in line with major depression, maybe with psychotic features, just a certain episode, or bipolar disorder, or maybe even schizoaffective disorder. But for some reason, they jump to the schizophrenia diagnosis. And so it's very problematic, especially because it's inaccurate, and that's going to lead to improper treatment. Black children are often misdiagnosed with ADHD and oppositional defiant disorder, as well as other behavioral difficulties, rather than properly assessed for PTSD and depression, which can mimic these symptoms. So when you're going through trauma, it impairs the executive functioning. That's your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that's near your forehead, the front of your skull. And when it becomes impaired, that causes everything to be a disarray when it comes to your focus, your organization, concentration, working memory, short-term memory. All of that is within your prefrontal cortex. And so when that becomes impaired, it's much harder to function, especially in a school setting. It's much harder to learn. It's much harder to behave properly and regulate when you're in a classroom. And so instead of really assessing for trauma, especially in communities with gang violence, community violence, lots of poverty, perhaps families that have domestic violence, things of that nature, natural disasters. Instead of properly assessing, they're often just labeled, oh, you have ADHD, oh, you're oppositional defiant. And that's really problematic as well, because perhaps they could get better treatment and better interventions if the accurate diagnosis is made, as well as not pathologizing children for acting out in ways that they're only trying to survive. So keep that in mind as well. Individuals within the Black community are offered psychiatric medication and therapy less often than their peers. And the rate of illicit drug use among Black individuals is slightly higher than the national average. That's 12.4% versus 10.25%, so just only slightly. However, it's important to consider that the rate of alcohol consumption is actually lower, and opioid overdose is less than half that of white counterparts, 6.6% versus 14%. So there's an interesting conundrum here as well. So as mentioned in the prior bullet point, offered medication and therapy less often. This is not just limited to psychiatric medication. So some of you may be familiar with Nicole Byer. She's a stand-up comedian. She's really funny. She did a stand-up on Netflix, I think recently, where she mentioned sometimes racism's good because they do not often prescribe Black individuals opioids for pain. Wanda Sykes also did a stand-up comedy special where she said she had a hysterectomy, and the famous joke that she made was, she's like, you know what they gave me? They gave me ibuprofen after a hysterectomy. So they often don't give Black folks opioids. So in a way, that's been good for our community because we haven't been as likely to become addicted to these really harmful drugs. But at the same time, again, we may not be getting the pain management that we need. And our pain is often minimized and dismissed. This is very common, especially for Black women. Medical bias hurts all people of color and it hurts all women, but it's obviously much more intense when it comes to Black women and women of color, and especially Native American women as well. But yeah, Nicole Byer said maybe racism's good because they didn't give her opioids when she broke her leg or something. And so she was commenting on how maybe that was a good thing. So yeah, just another thing to remember. So again, there's a lot of negative stereotypes and nasty ideas that people within the BIPOC community are more likely to abuse drugs, more likely to commit crimes. There's all of these really unhealthy, inaccurate assumptions that are made when actually the statistics show Black individuals are less likely to abuse alcohol and opioids. So again, just important things to look at important things to remember when looking at the data. Moving on to the Indigenous and Native American community and mental health. So this number, again, is a little outdated. The US population now, number of Native Americans and Alaskan Natives is actually 2.02%, I believe is the most recent number. As you saw in the last graph that I showed, it's actually 23% now that report having a mental illness. So that's almost 1 million people. So enough to fill every Major League Baseball stadium on the East Coast twice. So that is a lot. Native Americans and Alaskan Natives have a poverty rate in the US higher than any other ethnic or racial group, with 26.6% living in poverty. The national poverty rate is 14.7%. So that is a pretty big discrepancy. Approximately 21% lack health insurance. Indigenous peoples report higher rates of PTSD and alcohol dependence than any other ethnic group. I'm going to repeat that one in case it didn't hit you hard enough the first time. Indigenous peoples report higher rates of PTSD and alcohol dependence than any other ethnic group. And no, this is not some inherent moral failing or character flaw. This is because the trauma historical is so profound. 90 to 95% of Native Americans were killed when settlers came here. And if they weren't killed in warfare, they were killed due to infectious diseases such as smallpox and the flu, because those were not diseases that existed here until people came here. And don't make the mistake of saying American Indian. They're not Indian. That was Christopher Columbus's stupidity when he thought that he came to Asia. This is not Asia. So these are referred to Native American community and Indigenous peoples. But that trauma has stayed with this community. Imagine losing 90 to 95% of the people in your own community. That's incredibly grave and tragic. And so that has carried on. That trauma has been intergenerational, is passed down. And trauma also lives in our DNA. We can pass trauma on to our children. And so that is why the effects of mental illness are still so profound within this community. Native American children and adolescents have the highest rates of lifetime major depressive disorder than any other group. And Indigenous individuals are at the highest risk for death by suicide, with it being the second leading cause of death for adolescents and young adults, ages 10 to 34. So again, it has a lot of deep, profound effects that are still being felt today. In 2014, approximately 9% of Native American adults had co-occurring mental health and substance use disorders, a rate that is almost 3 times higher than the general population. Oftentimes substances are used to self-medicate. And so if you're dealing with anxiety, if you're dealing with depression, if you're dealing with PTSD, oftentimes, you go to a substance for relief. And so that is something that does unfortunately plague this community to this day. Majority of Indigenous individuals in the US live outside of reservations, yet those are the only locations of their culturally sensitive and relevant comprehensive mental health centers. I think a statistic I saw was something around 60% do not live on reservations. Yet if they want treatment that's going to be culturally appropriate for them, they may not be able to find it anywhere else. So it's an interesting contradiction. Mental health disparities among Indigenous peoples are directly linked to intergenerational historical traumas, as I mentioned: genocide, forced assimilation, displacement, removal of children from families, etc. The list goes on. And it's something that I don't really hear us talk about very often. We don't really talk about all of the horrible, inhumane tragedies that happened to Indigenous peoples. And there's so few of them living. You know, the fact that there's only about 2% of our population that is Native American, that's pretty scarce and pretty sad that there's so few left. But there are still so many tribes and so much resilience and so much pride as well. And so there are protective factors that exist in this community, which can alleviate some of these mental health disparities, such as strong connectedness with their culture, spiritual faith, supportive families, the wisdom of elders, and traditional health practices such as ceremonies and other ways that they treat each other, and homeopathic and alternative things that they use for healing. So there is a lot of strength and a lot of amazing protective factors that can help them heal through all of the tragedy and all of the trauma that they've faced. So moving on to the Latinx and Hispanic community and mental health. So I think the number went a little bit up. I think it's actually 17 or 18%. And the population number, I think, has also went up a little bit, but that would be over 10 million people. So that's more than the number of people who live in New York City. Again, that is gigantic. And I see that there's some messages in the chat. I cannot answer chat messages while I'm presenting because I cannot multitask, but I will get to any questions at the end. But all right, so 79% of the Latinx Hispanic community are US citizens. This is important. Only 33% of immigrants in the US are Latinx or Hispanic, though they're often misperceived as being a majority, which translates into a lot of discrimination. You know, when you hear politics on the news, when you hear certain people speak, I'm not going to name any names, but you often hear them refer to illegal aliens and immigrants. They always refer to the Latinx community as if they're the majority, but they're actually not. They're only 33%. Latinx individuals are at lower risk for psychiatric disorders than white counterparts. However, older Latinx adults and youth are especially vulnerable to psychological stress of immigration and acculturation. And I'll talk a little bit more about acculturation in a minute. Rates of mental illness are higher for US-born Latinx individuals than foreign-born. And that was interesting to me, but again, it's no surprise. You know, if you are born in your country of origin, it makes sense that you'd face a lot less stigma, a lot less discrimination, a lot less oppression. Whereas if you're born in the US, those are all embedded into the systems in place. So it makes sense that mental health challenges would be higher for those who are born within the US. Approximately 21% of this population are uninsured or have inadequate health insurance. This can be possibly due to immigration or citizenship status, but as mentioned earlier, majority are US citizens. So this could also just be due to poverty. Approximately 1 in 10 Latinx individuals with a mental health condition receive services from a general practitioner, and only 1 in 20 receive services from a mental health professional. So this is also interesting and notable, and this is because in the Latinx community, when they talk about mental health, they kind of remove it from the mind. It's more so somatic complaints. They more so are discussing physical health concerns or feelings within their body. One term that's often used is nervios, and so that's referring to just kind of like pain in the nerves, just this feeling of upset, this feeling of anxiety. So they often refer to things in a more physical context. So they're not necessarily looking for treatment from a mental health provider, even though that should be where they're going. But again, there's a lack of awareness. You know, these things are very stigmatized. So that could be why they're more likely to turn to a general practitioner instead. Having lack of access to bilingual professionals can be a barrier to receiving proper help. So this could also be a reason why they're more likely to talk to a doctor, because there's not many providers that are necessarily bilingual or fluent. And even if you're fluent, you may not even possess the vernacular to discuss mental health if you are not educated or trained in this field. So even if you speak fluent Spanish, if you don't know the terminology that's appropriate, you may not be able to help clients. Rates of suicidality have been higher among Latinx adolescents than in Black or white peers. And so that's definitely very concerning. And it has been on the rise for a few years now, especially in middle schoolers and high schoolers. Rates of underage drinking and cigarette use are higher in Latinx adolescents than in their Black or Asian counterparts. And religion is often a double-edged sword. It can be a great protective factor, or it can stigmatize mental health conditions and treatments. And so if you are told therapy goes against God, or you're told that that's in direct conflict, you can go to God for everything. Jesus Christ should be your savior. If you're told these types of things, and not just Christian centric, I'm sure there are other religions that may be stigmatizing of mental health as well. But when you're being told these messages, obviously you're going to be a lot less likely to get the help that you need. It's going to be a lot harder. This serves as a barrier, or you might just believe, no, I can do it alone. I have God, I have my religion, I have my faith that will help me. But depending on what kind of mental health condition a person has, some symptoms are not going to go away on their own. Some symptoms are not even going to go with therapy. Sometimes you do need medication. Sometimes you do need hospitalization. And so that's why sometimes religion might be a barrier more than something that is a benefit. So moving on to Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders and mental health. So this number actually went down. So it said 15% reported having a mental illness. It's actually 13% now. And I couldn't believe, again, how small the population is, 6.1. But again, that number may be a little outdated. But that's roughly 3 million people. So that's more than the number of dentists, post-secondary teachers, and lawyers in the United States combined. So again, these numbers are quite big. So AAPI are a very diverse group, speaking more than 100 different languages among subpopulations. 32.6% are not fluent in English, though. So this definitely serves as a barrier. As I just mentioned with the Latinx community, if they do not have providers that are bilingual, imagine speaking a language that providers, there's no provider speaking it. So that might be a huge hindrance into getting therapy if it's something that you need. 10.8% of Asian Americans live at or below the poverty level. 6.2% live uninsured. And these numbers are slightly higher for Native Hawaiians. 14.8% live at or below poverty level. 8.6% live uninsured. AAPI are less likely than any other racial or ethnic group to receive mental health services. And so that number, when we're looking at 13% now that are that have a mental health condition, that might be due to a lack of reporting. Because this community is so private, discussing mental health is considered taboo. So they might often dismiss, deny, or neglect their symptoms. And so that number may not be fully accurate. And a lot of these numbers, because there is a lot of stigma. And if you're less likely to talk about your mental health, then you're less likely to get assessed, diagnosed, and treated for it. So there could be a lot of mental health conditions that are just going unaccounted for. But because this is so taboo, it is very difficult for people within the Asian and Pacific Islander community to get the help that they need. They're 3 times likely than white counterparts to receive mental health services. So something to consider. In 2017, suicide was the leading cause of death alone for Asian Americans between the ages of 15 to 24. However, this rate is half that of whites. So again, interesting. And I do know that suicidality is more common for Asian American students, especially because the expectations placed on them to succeed and to study perhaps subjects that they are not necessarily interested in. Parents send their kids to college and say, you're going to study medicine, you're going to study economics, you're going to study law, I'm not paying for anything else. And therefore they're doing subjects that they're not necessarily passionate about. So suicide rates skyrocket because of that, or at least suicide ideation as well as hospitalization. I know that one of my friends, she works at UCLA and dispatch. And so she's there to help resident assistants in the apartments. And she says that the biggest call she always gets is suicidal students. So this is very common. And UCLA's campus is almost 50% Asian. So again, things to consider. 70% of Southeast Asian refugees receiving mental health treatment were diagnosed with PTSD. So that's pretty substantial. That is a huge chunk of their population. And of course, this is common for refugees. Obviously, you're exposed to all kinds of trauma. And so PTSD will come with that. 4.8% of AAPI live with a substance use disorder. And the model minority myth creates an unreasonable pressure for AAPI to meet societal familial expectations, which leads to poor mental emotional well-being. So again, I talked a little bit about how Black women are seen as strong, Black women, oh, so independent. Good stereotypes are just as detrimental as negative ones. Because Asians are seen as this model minority, There's so many expectations placed on them to be successful, to be smart, to do well. And if you're unable to meet those expectations, you're going to be met with a lot of mental and emotional challenges. So it's unfair when we think that we're saying good things about BIPOC by making up these stereotypes. It's actually more harmful than it is good. So, like I said, I would mention the mixed race experience. So the othering. So those who identify as mixed race, multi-ethnic, biracial, or multiracial often deal with a double discrimination or dual marginalization if they're not white passing or are racially ambiguous. I once had a friend, she's mixed race like myself, and she said she was so damn tired of people asking her, what are you? So what are you anyway? She was so tired of hearing that. She's like, I'm gonna start charging people $5 every single time they come up to me and say, what are you? What are you mixed with? Hey, what race are you? Hey, what ethnicity are you? Where are you from? You know, hearing that type of thing over and over again. And again, it's kind of reductive. It's like, what are you? It's like, I'm human. First and foremost, I'm a human person. I'm a woman. I'm, you know, whatever. So you get that question a lot. And so there is stigma associated with that. The dilemma of belonging to two or more worlds often means that you don't belong to any. Our society is very much a binary, dichotomous type of world. We love putting things in boxes, and we love when there's two. You're black or you're white, you know, you're gay or you're straight. We hate when there's nuance. We kind of hate as a society when there's something in the middle, when there's a gray area. That leads to confusion, you know, and I get it. As humans, it is our tendency to want to classify and categorize. That is how we understand the world. But there seems to be this aversion to anything that's in the gray area or that's in the middle. And so that's where this discrimination comes from. So though laws against miscegenation were ruled unconstitutional by the US Supreme Court in 1967, it wasn't until 2000 that individuals were allowed to identify as biracial on the census. 2000. That's not that long ago. So, you know, they weren't even allowed to identify as being more than one race. So that led to many people just disowning part of their heritage. You know, if they are able to pass as one race over another, they might then just begin to live as that identity. And that can cause you to have, you know, some own other mental health issues and a lack of accepting yourself or being accepted by others. Though many mixed race individuals feel proud of their diverse heritage and believe that it's an advantage, around 12 to 26% say they feel like an outsider. And more than 50% of mixed race individuals say they have been discriminated against or called racial slurs. A 2004 study, and I was trying to look for newer research, but this was one of the most recent ones I could find, found that mixed race individuals with at least one Black ancestor reported significantly more perceived discrimination than any monoracial group. So let that sit with you for a minute, let that marinate. Literally, they perceived more discrimination than Black individuals, than Native American individuals, because of their mixed race heritage, because of the racial ambiguity, because they didn't fit to one or more worlds, whatever it might be. One, I should say one world. So yeah, this is why, you know, these are the potential reasons why mental health challenges may be a little bit greater for those who fall into this category. But many feel the need to de-identify, as I had mentioned. They call it race switching in certain situations. And I've seen this often, you know, we run across the conflict when you're doing a census, you know, at least now there's the option. When you're doing surveys or you're filling out questionnaires, you're at the doctor's office or you're doing paperwork, and they have all these little boxes to check. You know, oftentimes those of us who are mixed, we don't know what to check. If there's no mixed race option or there's no other option, or there's no biracial option or whatever there may be, and many of us identify as multiracial, then, you know, it either forces us to pick a box and then pretend that we're just one race, or we have to just not even report what our racial identity is. We just have to omit the question, just ignore it. So again, these pose challenges for our community, and this could be why there are more significant mental health disparities for those of us that are mixed. So we looked at some of the unique challenges for each community. Let's look at some of the similarities now. So rates of mental health conditions, including mood disorders and substance use disorders, are steadily rising for all communities. And again, this doesn't necessarily mean that BIPOC are becoming more mentally ill. That's not what it means. Of course, we're still in a pandemic, and as you all know, the pandemic has caused many challenges. That's obviously going to be exacerbated for anyone who's in a marginalized community. However, what this may mean is that as we're becoming more open to discussing mental health as a society, as we are more likely to accept and embrace mental health, it may mean that more people are coming forward and getting the help they need. And so that means the numbers may be rising. It doesn't necessarily mean that these communities are becoming more sick or more likely to develop health conditions. It just means that they're being reported and they're being documented more often. Binge drinking, smoking, cigarettes and marijuana, illicit drug use, and prescription pain reliever misuse are more frequent among BIPOC adults with mental illnesses. So again, there's that stereotype that BIPOC are more likely to abuse substances. That is not the case. However, if you have a mental illness, of course, you may be more likely to self-medicate. And so that's where the abuse of substances comes in. Lack of awareness of resources and services available, as well as the stigma surrounding mental health issues, are the biggest deterrents in seeking professional help. Many BIPOC tend to seek out support from personal networks such as friends, family members, and religious community members rather than seek professional help for mental health concerns. And again, we talked about how it is taboo in certain communities to even talk about mental health. Certain languages may not even have a word for mental illness. So if it's something that you can't really talk about and you can't necessarily get help for, then you're more likely to turn to a friend or turn to a relative you trust, but you're not necessarily getting the help that you need to work through it. And the traumas of individualized and institutionalized racism account for these mental health disparities, not genetic differences. So as we saw in the graph that I initially showed, BIPOC, the numbers of mental illness, the prevalence is similar, it's comparable to white and Caucasian community. So therefore, there's really no genetic differences that are causing mental illness to be prevalent. However, it really is the trauma of racism. So this is not genetic. This is not something that comes from inherently being a person of color. This is something that comes from those unique traumas. So what are some of the barriers to accessing mental health care? Of course, there's economic barriers. So lack of health insurance or inadequate access to health insurance. As I mentioned, many within the BIPOC community do not have insurance or they're underinsured. Lack of access to comprehensive mental health centers. As I mentioned with the Native American community, majority of them don't live on reservations, but that happens to be some of the only locations of the mental health centers that are most relevant to them. This is also true for rural areas. If you live in a region that is more isolated, you're not necessarily going to have a nice big city mental health center to go to. So that may disconnect you from the help that you need. Language barriers, of course, as mentioned in many of the groups, there's a lack of bilingual mental health practitioners, interpreters, or linguistically trained providers. As I had mentioned earlier, you may speak a language very fluently, but you may not be versed in mental health. So you may not be able to communicate the challenges a person is facing or the treatments that they need. Stigma associated with mental health conditions. And there's a word for that. It's called saneism. And not many people know that, but racism and sexism are well known forms of discrimination, but saneism is a specific term for mental health stigma. And there's a gigantic lack of diversity of mental health providers. 86% of mental health professionals are white, 86%. So less than 2 to 4% are Black, approximately 5% are Asian, approximately 5% are Latinx, and only 1% are multiracial. So if you don't feel represented, you're probably not going to want to get support. If you feel that everybody you go to is not going to understand your experience, nobody looks like you, nobody understands your culture, nobody understands your language, nobody understands your experiences, you're less likely to get help. So this is a huge issue that we're working to fix, and I'm proud to be one of the few mixed race Black therapists that I know of. So I'm very proudful about that, very proud, but it's an issue. This is a huge disparity, and this is something that needs to change. But why is this? Well, being a mental health professional comes with its own challenges. It is very expensive. You go to school, you spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on loans. Most of the practicum and internships are unpaid. So that's why most people of color cannot afford to go into this profession, because you have to do unpaid work. And if you're, barely making it by, or if you come from poverty and your family is lower socioeconomic status, how is it feasible? How is it even sustainable to take on a position like this? So these things need to change. We need to fight for thriving wages, not just livable wages. We need to fight for the field itself becoming more inclusive and doing more to incorporate and to recruit more people of color. So this in turn leads to a lack of culturally competent mental health providers and a lack of culturally sensitive mental health services. So luckily, most of the tools that we use as therapists are becoming a lot more culturally sensitive. We use evidence-based practices. Many of them say that they can be modified to accommodate BIPOC. However, historically, that has not been the case. And so obviously, if you're going to therapy, but your provider is not educated in these types of topics or in the treatments that are going to help you and your community, then you're not going to get the help that you truly need. So that is also a huge issue. Distrust in the healthcare system and reasonable distrust. We know about historical tragedies such as the Tuskegee syphilis experiment or Henrietta Lacks. If you're not familiar with Henrietta Lacks, I think it would behoove you to look her up. But she was a woman that had cancer. And when she was receiving treatment, her cells were taken and distributed, and it was against her knowledge or her family's knowledge. And they are why we have HeLa cells, HeLa, today. Based on her initials, or H.E. Henrietta, and then Lacks, L.A. And so we still use those cells to this day for all types of science and all types of advancements to medicine. However, her family was never made aware, nor did they ever really receive, I'm not sure if anything has changed in the situation, but they did not receive reparations or compensation for that. And she died. So you can't blame us for having some distrust in the healthcare system when these types of injustices have happened over time. And like I said, there's still a lot of bias in medicine. There's still a lot of dismissing and minimization of symptoms, of our pain, of our stories when we go to the doctor. So you can't blame people for having some distrust. And difficulty differentiating mental health symptoms from somatic complaints. As I had mentioned earlier, especially in the Latinx community, but in many communities within BIPOC, sometimes symptoms are just seen as more physical. It's something that you notice in your body. It's something, oh, my stomach hurts. You may not be aware that there's an emotional cause for that. Maybe your tummy is hurting because you're anxious. Oh, your head's hurting. Maybe you're depressed. You're really tired. You're really fatigued all the time. Maybe you have depression and you're having an episode, or maybe you're bipolar and you're in a depressed phase. So when you're attributing symptoms to physical causes, you're not really looking at the mental health component. And again, there's a lack of awareness. It's maybe taboo to talk about. People are not educated. Mental health is not really something that is covered in K through 12 education systems. So not everyone knows how to recognize that their symptoms are attributed to a mental health condition. So what the heck is critical race theory? I'm sure you've heard a lot about it on the news, on television, on social media. It is all the rage lately. It's all everyone is talking about. There's a lot of controversy about it. So what actually is it? CRT is just how we understand and identify how racism still causes disparities for BIPOC today. As I mentioned, we know that historical injustices, horrible forms of oppression, genocide, slavery, all of those things have caused intergenerational trauma. So those effects are still lingering, but it's also laws and policies that are in place. So it's much more complex than that. So that's really what CRT is. It's just a way to understand that. So an easy way to get the differences here between interpersonal and institutional racism. So interpersonal racism, often referred to as individualized, is beliefs, ideas, statements, or actions that are racist and occur between individual people. So these can include hate crimes, microaggressions, stereotyping, and assaults. So here's some examples of microaggressions. Oh, you speak such good English. Where are you from? This is something that Latinx people often hear, Native American people often hear, Asian American, Pacific Islanders often hear, and it's just very ignorant and very disrespectful, assuming that a person is not from the nation that they live in just because their English is good. Maybe they are darker skinned, maybe they have darker hair, darker eyes, darker features. And so people, or lighter even, and people may assume that they're not from our nation when they are. And so the thing about microaggressions is that they're not necessarily intentional. It could just be misguided, or again, like I had started off the conversation by saying that The colorblind approach is problematic. Sometimes people have the best intentions, but when you say something like that, it's just completely unaware. It's completely disconnected from who this person is. So, maybe just refrain from comments like this. Oh, I wouldn't walk in their neighborhood. It's too dangerous, when referring to BIPOC. And you might think that these are pretty far out, ridiculous statements. Maybe people don't talk like this anymore, but I'd hate to break it to you. These are things that I hear. I was talking to a person online and I told them, they asked me what my research is on. And I said that I do include LGBTQIA plus community and BIPOC in my research. And they said, oh, I wouldn't walk in their neighborhood. It's too dangerous. They literally told me this. So this is something I just heard a few weeks ago. So these things are not foreign. These things are not outdated or obsolete. These are still happening. People still speak with this types of language. So again, these are problematic and detrimental. And microaggressions could be small. That's why the term micro is there, but that doesn't mean that their impact is small. These can still be traumatic experiences for some people of color. So just keep that in mind. As I mentioned earlier, stereotypes, even if a stereotype is positive and wants to be empowering, it can still be very detrimental. And of course, physical assaults as well. And not just physical, but like I said, online, there could be cyberbullying, there can be verbal, emotional assaults taking place. So again, other things to keep in mind. Institutional racism specifically occurs within and between institutions through discriminatory treatment, unfair policies, inequitable opportunities, or barriers to access. So this can include, but is not limited to, the areas of education, law, medicine, and of course, employment. But pretty much any area this can be applied to. So understanding systemic and structural racism. Imagine a house. That's really, I think, one of the best ways to explain it or to understand it. History is the foundation. It provides the framework through which these systems are built. And then racism is immersed within our culture that we live in. That's the actual structure of the house. We are living in this culture. So therefore it's being normalized and further perpetuated. And the institutions, policies, practices, and laws are what uphold it. They make it very difficult to dismantle. So Audre Lorde, she's an amazing feminist and critical race theorist. When she was alive, she was very phenomenal. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And so what does that mean? That means the tools that were used to create systemic injustices, structural racism, we can't quite use those tools of oppression to dismantle the system. We have to create new tools. We have to find new ways, alternatives to fix these problems, to find actual solutions. How do we fix these injustices that are so deeply ingrained within our society, within the very institutions that are in place? So, those are lots of questions that I may not be able to answer today, but one tool that I'm very fond of is intersectionality, which we'll get to in a minute. But here's a way to look at the differences between equality, equity, and liberation or social justice. So as you can see in the first example in this little comic, reality. That guy's got a lot of boxes to stand on. And look at these two fellows on the side. Look how sad that is. This one's in the floor, like he's in the ground. What happened to him? One gets way more than is needed, while others get less than is needed. Thus, a huge disparity is created. Again, I don't really want to say any names here, but when I look at this picture, I think of wealth. I think of the very unequal distribution of wealth. I think of people like Bezos and Musk. They got way too much. They don't even know what to do with. Like, that is unnecessary. You do not need that many boxes to stand on, okay? So then equality is usually what we think is the right answer, the right tool to fix these injustices. The assumption that everyone benefits from the same exact supports. This is considered equal treatment. But look at that image. Is everyone really benefiting from the same supports? No, this little guy, again, is getting the short end of the stick. He still can't see the game. The fence is still in his way. It's still blocking his view. So equality is not even necessarily the answer. Equity. Everyone gets the support they need, which produces equity. So this might be a solution, making sure that each person gets the support that they specifically need, not the same as everyone else, because a one-size-fits-all approach never works. So giving each person what they need, that works. But really a better solution or a better alternative is liberation or complete social justice, where we're taking the inequity away. The systemic barrier is completely removed. So no accommodations are needed. We don't need to come up with new tools or solutions if we could just take the barriers away in the first place. So that would be the ideal world. But again, that's not necessarily the world we live in. But I have hopes and faith. Maybe we'll get there someday. But again, this is just an example of what does structural racism look like? Well, think of like the topic we have today, mental health. If there's an inaccess to support, if there's taboo, if there's discrimination and oppression, if there's acts of racial violence happening, these are all the barriers that are in our way. And so that would be the fence that you're seeing here. And so the institutions are either exacerbating those problems or they're providing the supports like the little boxes that you see in this image. So again, just a way to think about what does this look like in practice or in theory or whatever way you want to put it. So like I said, I was going to talk about acculturation strategies a little bit. So acculturation is how individuals who are immigrants or refugees or second or third generation, it's how they adapt to the culture of the country they reside in. So these include assimilation, which is the adoption of the primary culture, but in a sense, losing of one's own culture, just kind of negating their own culture or forgetting about their own culture. Marginalization, which is strong holding of personal culture, but a complete denouncement of the primary culture. Separation, which is rejection of both cultures, perhaps creating your own culture and saying, hey, I refuse to be a part of either of these. I don't really want to practice what the primary dominant culture is doing, but I don't really care about my own country of origin either. So I'm just going to make my own thing. And integration, which is the adoption of aspects of both country of origin culture, as well as the primary culture in the country of residence. So in research and in the literature, integration is considered the healthiest acculturation strategy in terms of mental and emotional well-being. Marginalization is actually seen as the least healthy beneficial strategy. But again, these strategies are not even necessarily a choice. You know, again, like we had mentioned, or I had mentioned earlier, some people within the BIPOC community, they may not speak the language, you know, they may not speak English, they may not be fluent. So it's going to be a lot more difficult to integrate or even to assimilate into the primary culture if that is a barrier for you, you know? So we have to be mindful that yes, integration may be the healthiest, but that may not be an option for everyone. So again, as when we're talking about structural racism, we're talking about these barriers that are in place, it's different for everyone. Everyone has a unique combination of barriers as well as privileges. And so that's what we're going to get into next. So a tool that I'm very fond of is intersectionality. And we're going to do an activity surrounding this. But if you're not familiar with the term, intersectionality was coined by critical race theorist, feminist, and law professor Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. She was at the time, I believe, a criminal law attorney. And she coined this term because she noticed a phenomenon in which when people were being sentenced for the crimes that they committed, Black women were getting much harsher, longer sentences than their white women counterparts or their Black male counterparts. And so that's when she realized, wait, there's something going on here. It's because there's a combination of oppression that Black women face. They're both discriminated against for being Black, but they're also discriminated against for being women. So they're dealing with racism and sexism combined. And so that is why she created the term intersectionality. It was to really tackle and create a way to express what this unique challenge is. It's an analytical framework for understanding how each person's social and political identities intersect to create a unique combination of discrimination and privilege. So I'm gonna give you all a minute. Take a good look at this wheel of power and privilege. I like this graphic. It shows you that the identities that are in the inner circle are the ones with the most power or privilege, and those on the outer rim or the I want to say circumference, perimeter, I guess, of the circle, those are the ones that are most marginalized. And so these are all the different areas of identity that we each hold. You know, you're either lower class or you're upper class. You're either rich or you're poor, you know, or your mental health is vulnerable if you have a mental illness or a mental health condition. Maybe it's robust if you don't have any type of condition like that. Take a good look at this power and privilege wheel just for a few seconds, and it's going to help us do the activity that we're going to move on to. All right, I'm going to stop sharing and then I'm going to start sharing once again. For our activity, feel free to unmute yourself if you're comfortable doing so. Do not type in the chat because I will not be able to read it while we're doing this activity. But let's come up with a person. We are going to create our own individual. As a group, let's make a baby. We're going to make a person. So what do we want to name this imaginary person? Anyone shout out a name. Don't be shy.
Scarlet.
Scarlet. Ooh, I love that name. That's my favorite color. Okay,
Great.
Scarlet. All right. So, what is Scarlet's gender? Anyone shout it out.
Female.
Female? Okay. All righty. What is Scarlet's race or ethnicity?
Biracial.
Sorry?
Biracial.
Biracial, okay. Biracial, mixed race. What is her class or socioeconomic status? Anybody shout it out.
Middle.
Lower. Yeah.
I hear middle and I hear lower. What do we want to go with?
Middle.
Middle.
Lower class.
Middle? Okay. What is her occupation?
Accountant.
Ooh, an accountant. Okay, cool. All right. What is her citizenship status?
Citizen.
US citizen? Okay. What is her age?
35.
35. Cool. She's a millennial. I like her already, but I'm biased. So, what is her religion? Does she have a religion?
Catholic.
Catholic. Ah, okay. What is her sexual orientation? Anybody?
She's hetero.
She's straight. All right, cool. Cool. And last but certainly not least, does she have any mental health conditions? Does she have any disabilities?
Depression and anxiety.
Got it. All right. And when we said that she was biracial or mixed race, what two or more specific races was she?
Black and Asian.
Sorry, what was that?
Black and Asian.
Black and Asian. Okay. Black and Asian. Okay. So let me see if I can zoom this in a little bit for y'all. So now that we have our imaginary person, Scarlet, she is mixed race. She's half Black and half Asian. She's middle class. She works as an accountant. She's female. She's a US citizen. She's 35 years old. She lives with depression and anxiety. She's Catholic and she's straight. Based on what you just learned about mental health disparities for BIPOC, as well as structural systemic racism and the barriers that are in place, what types of challenges might Scarlet have?
She has, okay, sorry.
Okay, go ahead.
I was gonna say, she has shame. She doesn't want to go to, she's not revealing that she has these struggles. She recognizes it, but she's very afraid of anybody finding out. So she hasn't sought treatment.
Yeah, thank you for that. I can't see who's sharing. My apologies, because I'd refer to you by name, but thank you. Yes,
That's
especially, especially because she's Catholic. There's a lot of internalized shame that comes from Catholicism. And depending on what Catholic church she's a member of, they may not be open to mental health. They may not be open to supporting therapy or other types of treatment. Or, if she's going to a Catholic church that is conducive to healing, that does support therapy and thinks that it can coexist with religion, then maybe she is getting the help she needs. But as you mentioned, she probably does have a lot of shame. She's from two marginalized groups. She's half Black, she's half Asian. So she might get, depending on how she looks, she might look very racially ambiguous, or she might look like more of one race than the other. Depending on how she is perceived in the world, she may get some of that, model minority myth or that strong Black woman stereotype. People might assume that she's much stronger or capable than she is. People may not help her when she is at a vulnerable state or in a vulnerable moment. So yeah, that's a good thing to consider. What other challenges based on some of these unique identities that we gave her would she have?
She may not be able to find providers that she identifies with, just being mixed race, as you mentioned before.
Thank you for that. Yeah, only 1% of providers are mixed race. And she's Black and she's Asian. Only 2 to 4% are Black and approximately 5% are Asian. So she may not be able to find a provider that she feels represented by, that she feels safe with. That's definitely a huge barrier that she might face. Other challenges based on these unique identities.
I think in the middle class accounting field, there may not be a lot of other people that look like her in the company. So she might feel somewhat isolated.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. Again, that sense of feeling like an outsider that we mentioned on the slide specifically about mixed race community, she may not be represented at her job. She may be one of the very few women. She may be one of the only Black people, one of the only Asian people, and one of the only mixed people. So definitely that might be a barrier. What are some other challenges? And maybe not just challenges, but we can also look at what privileges does Scarlett have?
She's a US citizen.
That's a huge privilege. I do unfortunately have clients who are immigrants and who do not have citizenship status, and it is a huge barrier for them. It is incredibly alienating, isolating. There's so much they don't qualify for, things such as financial aid, things as public benefits, certain jobs they may not be able to get depending on what type of visa they have. So that would be a huge barrier, but at least Scarlett has that going for her. She's got a lot of identities here where she is marginalized and she does face a lot of different types of oppression. But yes, being a US citizen is not one of those. Other areas of challenges for Scarlett or barriers.
Female, especially.
Yes, being a woman. Definitely, she might deal with sexism. She might deal with medical bias when she goes to the doctor. She might be dealing with sexual assault or sexual harassment. All the other things that come with sexism. So that's definitely
she has to work twice as hard to maintain her job and to advance. She's going to have to really be aggressive. Or it should be assertive, but they'll interpret it as being aggressive. So
right. And there's just some recent studies that have come out lately that say women often in the workplace are more likely to be referred to as terms such as abrasive, difficult, bad attitude, aggressive, when they're just being assertive, they're speaking up, they're straightforward, they're defending themselves or their work. They're often perceived in such a negative light. So yeah, that's definitely one of them, sexism, misogyny. What else, based on these unique identities, what are some other challenges or privileges that Scarlett may have?
I want to put a privilege out there, or an advantage, is that she's straight.
Yes.
Because when you're straight, you don't have to deal with the stigma of being in the other categories. I can't imagine how difficult it is to be, gay or any of the LGBTQ plus.
Yep, exactly. That is a huge privilege she has. If she had all of these identities, and then on top of that was also queer, was also within the LGBTQ community, then she also might be facing homophobia, transphobia, or biphobia. So that would be a huge barrier, definitely. But she does have the privilege of being straight. What else? What other challenges or privileges does Scarlett have?
Madison put in the chat that she probably has health insurance, which is true.
Yeah, and I didn't even put that here. I should have put that, but there's not a lot of room. But yeah, if she's an accountant and she's middle class, she probably does have health insurance. So, maybe if she's able to come to a support group such as DBSA, or if she has a good friend who persuades her to try therapy, or if her church is an accepting environment and they say that therapy is a good thing, maybe she would be able to tackle her depression and anxiety because she would be able to have health insurance to cover it, definitely. So what else? What other privileges or challenges, privileges or challenges does Scarlett have?
Challenge could be age.
The age, being 35?
And an accountant And they're usually a little bit older than that.
Mm-hmm. So in her field, she is a woman. She is Black and Asian. She deals with depression and anxiety. And then on top of that, she's 35. So she might be dealing with ageism, sexism, and racism, all within her job, and maybe even saneism. If she's private about her depression and anxiety and nobody knows about it, then maybe it's not being stigmatized openly. But people do know she's young. She might be one of the only women at her job. She might be one of the only BIPOC at her job, and she's young. So she probably deals with a lot of crap. What else, if there's any other challenges or privileges that we see here that haven't already been mentioned?
Somebody asked, but does she have kids?
That's a good one
Good
too.
question.
That's great. Yeah, we don't know. Unless someone wants to shout it out there, does she have kids? Do we want to give her kids or do we want her to be childless?
And if so, how many? Somebody else asked.
What do we want to do, y'all?
She's a single parent. Oh, here we go.
Ooh, single
That's
parent.
a
How many
challenge.
kids?
Yeah.
How many kids does she have?
5.
Ooh, 5. Ooh, well, dang. Good thing she's an accountant. She needs some money for 5 children. Wow.
Oh, my
So yeah,
goodness.
being a single parent, Black and Asian. So again, you know, as I mentioned in that one slide earlier, majority of Black households are single run. They are completely headed by a Black woman. So she deals with 5 children. Good thing she has a middle-class job. There's no way else she'd really be able to cover that many children. So now she has that on top of all of this stress. So dealing with potential ageism, dealing with potential sexism, with racism, and then mental health challenges, also having to deal with a big family. So yeah, so these are just many of the ways our unique mixture of identities affect us. We get either different types of discrimination, or in turn, we get different types of privilege. And so we each have very distinct differences. And so congratulations to you all, because you just officially did an activity on intersectionality. So now you know what that is, and now you can teach others. So let me get back to the presentation. Thank you. All right, so that was intersectionality. So now if anyone ever asks you, what the heck is that? Or they say, what is critical race theory? Or I don't want that in my school. I don't want my kids to learn that. Just explain this is what it is. It's what we just did today. Y'all just did a critical race theory. Congratulations. Go get a sticker that says, I did CRT. Make it your next, I don't know, cocktail party topic, whatever. But this is literally what critical race theory is. And this is one of the tools that we can use to dismantle some of the systemic injustices that we face. And basically, you know, when I hear that conversation, I laugh internally when they say, oh, I don't want that in my elementary school. I don't want that. Critical race theory is graduate level discourse. This is not going to be taught to any kids in elementary school. I assure you of that. But the activity that we just did is just a good example of how we understand some of the different injustices that we face, as well as the privileges that we benefit from, and how we can work to either help someone or, you know, how these things hurt them. All right, so a new chapter. As I had mentioned, you know, in the mental health field, there was a lack before, especially historically, of culturally competent practices, culturally competent literature, research, you know, everything. Especially BIPOC have been missing from a lot of research for many, many years. They're starting to be incorporated. So good news is that the DSM-5, which is kind of like the Bible for therapists, if you will, a new edition just came out, which we've been waiting for a very long time, as the DSM-5 had not been updated, I believe, since 2004, maybe 2013. I think it was 2004. So they finally made a text revision. And in the updated version, it just came out this month, by the way, so this is brand new. They now have considerations of the impact of racism and discrimination on mental disorders that is integrated into the text. And they stress the point that I made earlier, that mental health disparities within the BIPOC community are not the fault of the BIPOC community. These are not genetic, these are not inherited. This is due to the traumas of racism and discrimination. So they are making a note of that in our material now. So that's a really great step forward. And I'm happy to finally see some changes that are long overdue. So protective factors. We obviously went very deep into the disparities, but let's talk about some of the great protective factors that also exist. So these are what keep BIPOC individuals healthy and well, despite all of the challenges that they go through. So these include, but are certainly not limited to, having strong cultural affiliation. You know, if you have that sense of belonging, if you are proud about your heritage, that's definitely a protective factor. Staying connected with family and friends. Deep roots in spirituality, you know, or religion, specifically one that is conducive to personal growth and healing. You know, like I said, it can be a double-edged sword. Not every religion is open to mental health or even discussing it or seeking treatment such as therapy. But those religions that are, those churches that embrace therapy and see it as in conjunction with their belief system, those are the ones that are most supportive and that are beneficial. Utilization of support groups and other community resources, of course, such as DBSA, such as therapy, such as mental health centers, participation in inclusive spaces, you know, either with their peers, with others in the BIPOC community, or not necessarily, you know, even in community spaces that are just inclusive of everyone. You know, that's definitely a great resource to have. Education and upward social mobility. You know, like I said, there's not always the terminology for mental health challenges. Sometimes it's difficult to differentiate if you're going through a somatic complaint, a physical symptom, or a mental health one. And so when you have that education, that empowers you to know what you're going through and to get the help that you need. And then when you do receive education, obviously it's not possible for everyone. Like you said, there are many systemic barriers in the way, but for those who are able to get educated and become enlightened, they are then able to get out of poverty, you know, move forward, help their family, help their community. Again, this is not possible for everyone. There are a lot of barriers in the way, but it is incredibly beneficial for those who are able to do so. And healthy lifestyles. And when I say healthy lifestyles, I don't mean any particular type of lifestyle. I just mean having healthy habits, you know, sleep hygiene, eating nutritious meals, having a good diet, you know, getting exercise, just general overall healthy habits are definitely conducive to personal growth and healing and managing mental health conditions. And so cultural humility, and this is one of my favorite pieces, especially to end with. Not everyone can be culturally competent, no matter how well-trained or educated they are. You know, I mean, we've talked about so many communities within BIPOC, and that's not even all of them. You know, there's so many communities out there. No one person is going to have the answers to everything. But when we have cultural humility, it means that we are sensitive. We have awareness. We're an ally. We're an advocate. We have humility. You know, it's not about knowing everything or being the expert or being correct. It's not about that. It's about accepting the fact that we're not going to have all the answers. It's impossible to know everything. We're going to make mistakes, but we can always be willing and open to learning. And we can always do our power to be as compassionate and have empathy and be respectful and mindful as possible. That's really what it's about. So if there's anything that you take away from today, I hope this is the message. So for more information, if I didn't overload you enough, this is a great book, Community Psychology in the Pursuit of Liberation and Wellbeing. This book covers everything from race and ethnicity to immigration to LGBTQ community to gender. It covers everything. So it's a really good tool to have. A lot of the information in this presentation was from this book as well. How Communities Can Address BIPOC Mental Health Needs by Dr. Daniel Rameau in Psychology Today. There is a link to this, and you might all receive a copy of this presentation as well. So these are all hyperlinked in the PDF file. Mental illness doesn't discriminate, so why do BIPOC communities have difficulty accessing care? A lot of the barriers that were mentioned in this presentation were from this article. Microaggressions are a big deal, how to talk about them and when to walk away by Andrew Limbong, NPR. So that's a great article if you'd like to learn more about microaggressions and ways to address them. Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome is a really good book, and there are lectures on YouTube available for free by Dr. Joy DeGruy-Leary. And that really talks about how historical and interpersonal traumas and intergenerational traumas are still impacting communities today, especially the Black community. And Seek Out More Work by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. If you liked the activity that we did on intersectionality and you liked learning about the term, she has amazing resources. She has a wealth of knowledge. She does lots of interviews on YouTube for free. She does lectures. Sometimes she does events that you could actually attend. She is still teaching. She is still a professor. She is wonderful. One of my heroes, definitely. So definitely look more into her if you'd like to learn more. And if you happen to be BIPOC and you're looking for a culturally sensitive therapist, here are some websites that you can go to. Iona Therapy, Inclusive Therapists, Hurdle, and Unmute. These are just a few, but they are databases or apps that serve primarily to match individuals with a therapist who is like-minded or who's from their culture or who will be sensitive to their unique needs and accommodating. So these are great resources to use or to refer to others. All right, so that is it for the main presentation, and we did our activities. So I will open it up to questions or comments. And these are my references, and thank you.